Hello and welcome back to Inside Update, a show brought to you by InsideInvestigator.org. We are a nonprofit newsroom creating investigative journalism to root out corruption in Connecticut. My name is Connor Dragotis. I'm the managing editor here, and today I'm joined by Katherine Revello to talk about her newest investigation and also a news story that she wrote about the ongoing saga at Pura. So we're going to be talking electricity rates here as well. Let's start with sole suspect using FOIA behind bars. This is an investigation that came out on April 13th. Bring us up to speed. Let's talk about Mr. Silva and some of his struggles here.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously FOIA. I don't know if you know, Connor, but I like to talk about FOIA. And while we talk about a lot of issues that people have with FOIA, one of the aspects we haven't really gone into that is what happens if you're incarcerated and, you're trying to prove your innocence to get a conviction challenged or overturned, which is the case in the story. Is FOIA a great tool for that? And, what are some of the challenges? And so that's primarily what this story is about. This is a case from 2012 where Cordero Silva was convicted of murdering a distant cousin of his, I believe Javon Zimmerlin. Let me just make sure I'm getting that name correct. Yeah, Javon Zimmerman. So he was convicted. The murder occurred in 2012. He was convicted a couple of years later and sentenced to 63 years in prison. Which is a long time, which was the maximum sentence, and also there were some underlying parole violations at issue there. And what's kind of unusual about this case is even though police and everybody from the beginning of this agreed that, um, Cordero was the person who was guilty, and he was kind of the sole suspect. Cordero says he didn't do it, and he says he did, but he never told anybody that. And that gets into some of the underlying issues surrounding this investigation. There was a drug investigation into Zimmerman and his associates. Silva was swept up a little bit in that, was also a police informant. That detail is never mentioned anywhere in the investigation or the trial. Um, and so there's some, underlying issues going on with he says he's protecting his family, and that's why he never told police why he knows he did it. But, what this investigation is not about is whether Silva is guilty or innocent. This is about FOIA. This is about what happens when there are irregularities in criminal court cases and how those get challenged once you're incarcerated and the difficulties that exist if you are a person in the prison system who says you're innocent.
Well, I think we know that there are wrongful convictions, right? And that, estimates range, I think, from 2 to 10%. Like the actual studies are uh, put a pretty wide range on the percentage of wrongful convictions in the United States. But this guy definitely from day one, I think the quote that you had in there is, give me the whole 63. I'm not going to do half of it. So, of course, you're right. Yeah, like this investigation is not looking at the facts and saying, oh boy, yeah, we have someone who didn't commit this murder or did commit this murder. Like, we're not trying to come down and say, uh, I guess, do the police work for or, re-adjudicate this case. But it is interesting because there are a lot of people with a lot of time on their hands in prison working to uncover evidence that could get them out of there, could put them back into the community, back to living their lives. What are those hurdles? Like, what are these people dealing with? And is it Silva specifically that's dealing with something unique, or are these just larger systemic problems that we should be aware of?
Well, I think we know from our own experience that these are larger systemic problems. DOC is one of the agencies we complain about the most. It's one of the agencies we have the most difficulty getting basic records requests answered with. And it's long been a suspicion of mine. And in fact, I have an outstanding FOIA to this effect that as bad as DOC treats people like journalists, people who are outside of the prison system, it treats those who are incarcerated even worse. And if you follow the FOIC and a lot of complaints that end up being adjudicated, you see there are a lot of complaints that come from DOC. And, not all of them are legitimate. A lot of times it's people who don't understand the process. And that I think is one institutional limitation on people who are incarcerated and who are trying to use FOIA is, you know, if you are outside of prison and you need help with requests, there are quite a few resources out there to help you. That's not necessarily available if you are behind bars. But also, and we go into this in depth in the piece, if I ask for a FOIA request for DOC, they just turn those documents over to me. That's not the case if you're incarcerated. Those documents are supposed to be delivered individually to who the person who has requested them, but they are reviewed by DOC to screen out things that might be quote unquote a security risk. And there have been a bunch of court cases to this effect because it's been very confusing for agencies who haven't been sure whether that means they have to send them to DOC or what their obligation is. And we get into that a little bit. But another issue is, right, the law enforcement exemption in FOIA is the biggest exemption. There are a lot of parts to it. There are a lot of different elements that prevent records from being released. And that is, part of what has, it's a couple of dozen requests that Silva has filed, has had issues with police departments not complying, has had to go to the FOIC to get that, and has had certain records redacted under those exemptions. Right, because a lot of those exemptions have to do with, if somebody is an informant or somebody was a witness to a crime and they have not otherwise been identified to the public, or if there's a security risk in identifying them through the release of those records can be redacted. So, all of that plays into it. All of that plays into, records that might be key to helping with your defense and trying to overturn your conviction could potentially be withheld. It's something we've had a conversation about behind the scenes a little bit where, just because your name is mentioned in a record, which at the federal level, there is an expectation that if there are records that mention your name, that you have a right to them. That's not the case in Connecticut. And again, that's something that can complicate things like Silva is trying to do, which is to get the police reports on the investigation where they basically said, hey, we're pretty sure that you did this and we're not looking at anybody else, and trying to uncover discrepancies in them. And there are a number of them, and we go into detail on some of them in that investigation. But there's no guarantee that you're going to get them either because of those police exemptions, or because DOC might say, we think you having this information is a security risk.
Can we dig deeper on security risk? Because I know that we have seen some claims of this in the past, right? If I'm remembering correctly, when you wrote the investigation, Religion and Redactions, we dealt with a Mr. Harris, and we had files that were redacted that were not given to us. And, there were some of these exemptions claimed, but then when we got the unredacted files from the individual's attorney, it turned out not only were they fairly innocent, basic information type stuff, but they actually were vital to understanding the very complaints of wrongdoing that he was making. I guess, maybe it's a who watches the watchman type thing. And, I'm the first to admit, working in journalism, I am biased toward transparency. I, I think that there should have to be an obligation to, you should have to go to something like the FOIC to get something redacted. And, rather than the other, there should be the first step should be transparency. If you want to withhold something, you should have to jump through the hoops. We should not have to jump through the hoops. That's not the way the system works. I get it, but I guess, can you help us understand a little bit about what does security actually mean in this situation, or what are they trying to claim?
Well, I wish I could help you understand that, but you and I have the same position on a lot of these things. And, I know it's been an ongoing project that we've been doing behind the scenes, trying to get a lot of records from DOC to try to nail some of this stuff down and find out, what accountability exists. And we've been stymied by it a lot of times. And right with that religion and redactions exemption, right, we ran into the exact same thing where part of the security exemption that DOC claims when it reviews FOIA responsive records to FOIA requests and withholds them is, stuff like, is somebody else who is named in these records or who is associated with these crimes, incarcerated in the same facility, because that could generate an issue, which on the one hand, we know there are, SRGs, security risk groups, and that kind of things. We know there are real issues with those in prison. Whether a document that simply states something that has been reported in news as fact or is verifiable, whether that's actually a security risk, I can't really tell you. My suspicion is it's probably not, and that gets overused in a lot of cases to deny access to records. We saw that in that religion and redaction story where they tried to tell us that knowing the location of certain prisoners who had been transferred out of the state of Connecticut was a security risk, which of course an attorney for the subject of that story said that's not the case. Is also the case with a lot of the crimes that these people have committed, which you are entitled to know that information. It's identifiable because it has been reported in the media. So it's something that you can piece together. So, again, whether or not that's abused or a legitimate claim that DOC is making, obviously it's my opinion, but in our experience, I think that that is sort of a vague term that can be defined to mean a lot of things that they want it to mean. And if you try to challenge that and get documents that show that, a lot of times you run into what we've run into, which is they're going to turn around and claim those same exemptions on you, and it's effectively unknowable.
I definitely want to hear from anyone who's watching or listening to this. If you've run into these types of things, every time that we put out something that's criminal justice reform related, or telling a story about someone who's having a difficulty in prison with, accessing their rights, we tend to get an influx in tips, an influx in information of people saying, I know something that has happened that's similar, but I think related specifically to FOIA, if you are running into barriers, we definitely want to hear about it, because, again, whether or not you're ultimately successful in your case, it's kind of beside the point. If you can't even access the information to try to make an argument or make a claim, that's a whole different ball game. It's one of the reasons I think that we consider, our mission to root out corruption. We consider transparency to be upstream of that. If that word makes sense, I think I use it frequently enough that you understand what I mean by it. But transparency flows down to actually being able to deal with corruption. So if everything's stuck in this black box that we can't review, the number of things that we get a dozen tips a day. If we have the inability to even examine them for validity, you're stuck with one of two problems. Either you're stuck with a logjam because you have to evaluate every single thing, or you can't evaluate anything. And newspapers and excellent journalists like yourself who are passionate about bringing good into the world by eradicating corruption, you're stymied, you're stuck, you're stuck in this logjam. So I think if we can break that a little bit, and fix those problems, the downstream effects are going to be much more positive. Again, not saying that everyone is going to say, oh, it's, this is not a get out of jail free card. That's not even an argument in favor of that. It's saying you need to be able to get a little bit further down the road. And that does start with reliable information that, heck, whether it's journalists or attorneys, I know you talk about some of the struggles of, inmates not being able to do this alone and relying on nonprofit legal help to tackle these problems. Um, I don't know. Justice is important. When justice isn't happening, corruption is often the reason, and we do have an interest. So all that to say, if you're aware of situations, don't hesitate to email tips@insideinvestigator.org or insideinvestigator.org /whistleblower, where you can upload larger files that might be relevant. And, we can't guarantee coverage, but I can guarantee you we will take a look. We do not let things just sit and fester. We take a really close look to see if we can do anything with it. Um, yeah, anything else that you want to talk about with this investigation?
Yeah, I think the only other thing I'll mention, right, is FOIA is a big part of it. The other part of it, obviously, is there were a number of irregularities in the initial trial that went on, right, including um, uh, Silva's, or, well, not court appointed, but a public defender who, obviously is assigned. Right, he had a number of issues with very public, right, and again, this is a great story to talk about the impact of local journalism because this trial was so incredibly well documented by local media, which makes it really, really easy to write this story, almost 20 years down the road. Um, Right. So very public, issues with his lawyer, asks multiple times if he can represent himself and is told no by the judge, which, I think is kind of shocking. It's certainly shocking to me because, that's the right to, act in your own defense is something that's in the Constitution. So, I think that's something that I didn't even know that that was something that could be denied. But so that plays into the trial issues. There are a number of other issues he has with his attorney about the introduction of evidence, which he says doesn't go the right way. He isn't kept updated on the case. And, all of that, the fact that this doesn't get brought up at trial plays into what goes on down the scenes when we're talking about, criminal justice. And, once you've been convicted of a crime, and even if you are legitimately innocent, and again, we're not making any judgment about whether that's the case here, it's incredibly difficult to get a conviction overturned, even with direct evidence of that on your side. So all of these issues, play into it, and the fact that they don't get brought up at trial, or there are issues at trial that then necessitate the use of FOIA to try to make a case after the fact, makes it incredibly difficult to then try to mount a defense to get a conviction overturned. So, that's also, I think, an important aspect of the story that unfortunately, we were trying to get a defense attorney to talk about this, to talk about some of what the challenges are when you're trying to overturn your conviction from prison. But I did just want to highlight that too. I know that's, criminal justice issues are another thing that we I've tried to delve a little further into, and again, there's not great record keeping in this state on things like, plea bargaining, which we've tried to do an investigation into, and things like that. So, in the same vein as, transparency and public access, all of that is connected.
Yeah, credit to New Haven Independent. I know you cited their work a lot, but you're right. Having journalists who are paying attention to this stuff, of course, it's valuable in the moment to pay attention to what's going on, but we don't talk often enough about the historical record that it creates either, because it's a whole nother way to look back. And man, hindsight's 2020. Sometimes you just things pop out 10 years later that, wow, they really turned out to be valuable for a discussion of justice. Um, Thank you for that investigation too. Just generally, really great piece. Head over to insideinvestigator.org to read that. Let's switch over to a very recent bit here. We're recording this on Wednesday, so this is an article that was published yesterday, April 15th, Tuesday. Headline here is Senate confirms Gillette for Pura, Republicans stage walkout. Very popular article yesterday. Lots of people have been following the Pura saga. Again, we're talking about backroom deals, unprecedented messages, lots of different stuff here. I guess bring us up to speed.
Right. So obviously, Marissa Gillette, we know, has been in the news a lot between the her nomination through the ELN committee, which brought her to the both chambers of the legislature for final approval, so she can serve a second term on Pura's board of commissioners. And I think, right, Mark Fitch, I think, has done a lot of the heavy lifting on these stories with, the issue with, allegedly Gillette has been rubber stamping thousands of Pura decisions by using an executive secretary's, easy for me to say, signature stamp, and the back and forth that the utility companies have had with Pura. So, the backroom deal, which depending on what part of the aisle you're on, I think either definitely happened.
We always put it in quotes
Yeah,
coverage because it's Harding's words, right? Senator Harding said
correct.
that, and I think a lot of people. I've been surprised that so many news outlets have not put it in quotes and they've just been saying it outright.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that that's the right step to take from a news perspective.
Right.
Maybe to put that in context.
Right. We know that Lamont has a quote where he basically said that he felt a deal was necessary in order to get Gillette through the nomination committee. The specific details of that, I don't know. Right. We know expansion to 5 commissioners, which, by the way, is already state law. That just isn't being followed. Was on the table. We know making it a quasi-public, moving it out from under Deep's authority. was also on the table and part of that conversation. Um, Certainly, Republicans have, are stating for a fact that this happened, that influenced the decision, and that's the reason that Gillette has moved forward. And, as a result, the House last week voted to advance her nomination, which was actually a pretty tame, I thought, debate. You did see a couple of Republicans cross the aisle and say supportive things about Gillette. You did see a couple of Democrats, object to certain things. That was certainly not the case in the Senate yesterday, where the Senate Republican caucus held a press conference before the session started and announced that they were going to take the unprecedented move and walk out of the chamber, and not vote on the nomination. I think the biggest point that they were making that was they did not want their constituents to be complicit in what they saw as the underhanded way that Gillette's nomination has moved forward.
I gather that there was a lot of, I mean, it seemed like frustration. I mean, obviously we know that it's a Democrat majority in both bodies there. So, I mean, Republicans didn't really have any other choice, right? I mean, this was a foregone conclusion, assuming that it was going to fall along party lines, which in the Senate it certainly did. In the House, I know you mentioned that there, I can't remember what the vote was, but a little bit of crossover at least in the discussion. Um, I mean, is that's it, right? They're just trying to make a point. I think everybody is on the same page. Costs are high. Nobody's super happy about that. That's certainly not a partisan issue. It's just a disagreement about whether or not Gillette is able to be part of the solution or part of the problem, or that her ideas aren't good enough. I mean, like, can we drill down a little bit into what's the hope now that she is officially getting a second term?
Yeah, right. I think there are a couple of issues. Obviously, high electricity costs is one of them. I think Republicans have certainly tried to tie that issue, if not to Gillette herself, then to Pura and the way that it's behaved. Democrats, especially during the legislative sessions where they voted on Gillette's renomination, made the point that Gillette has turned down a number of rate increase proposals from the utilities, and Pura itself does not entirely control electricity rates, so they've tried to distance that self a little bit. I think Republicans are also frustrated because they have put a lot of legislative proposals forward to do things like change the public benefits charge and otherwise address high electricity rates. And we have Democratic majorities in both chambers, so they really haven't gone anywhere. So I think there is, I don't want to say bipartisan consensus because I don't get the sense, at least from what's going on publicly, that they're in agreement on what to do. But I think, you know, people are definitely angry about high electricity prices. So I think they're aware that it is kind of an exigent political issue and something needs to be done about it. What exactly that's going to be, I don't know if there's any consensus on that.
Hurry up and wait. That's a good, I guess not a great position to be in, but it does seem to be our reality. Thank you for tracking this one and keeping your eyes on what's going on. Of course, I appreciate you giving credit to Mark as well. I know he has written a number of investigations that everyone, I think, if you're interested in how your electric bill is formulated and what the different pieces mean, why is this public benefits thing happening? There's no one better in the state of Connecticut who has written about that. These deep dives will give you a true comprehensive understanding to go out into the world and speak competently about it. Pick your arguments wisely, I suppose, and go from there. Uh,
I think Mark will be very happy if he doesn't have to write about Pura
It's
anymore.
good. I agree with that. Yes. I feel like every week he's like, I just got X, Y, and Z. He's getting calls and emails and texts at all hours from folks all over the state on that one. Kind of like family court, actually. And now DSS, DDS. I mean, I feel like we're in a good spot in that people are recognizing that even if other newsrooms aren't returning their calls or returning their emails, we're here for it. We're not going to leave you hanging. That's part of our commitment to doing this business the right way. And I don't know, it seems to be working. I'm excited about it. I'm very thankful for all of you and all the work that you do every day. Anything else that you want to flag for folks out there before we wrap up?
No, I'll just, I think, say what we always say, which is send us tips. Like you said, we don't guarantee coverage, but we do excuse me, guarantee that we will read them and review them and do whatever research into them we can.
Absolutely. That pesky legal boilerplate that we always have to throw in there to make sure. All right. Well, cool. Thank you, Katherine, again for all your work. Everybody out there, thank you so much for watching, listening, tuning in. Much more to come on this and so many other topics. Check out our website where we also have articles, for example, about a new proposed soda tax that you might be interested in checking out. Otherwise, please have a great few weeks. We'll be back in 2. And until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.